The rain had already started before Oliver stepped off the evening train, and by the time he reached the narrow street where the old bookstore stood, the city seemed wrapped in a silver curtain of water and memory. He paused beneath the faded sign above the entrance and stared through the window. Nothing appeared to have changed. The same wooden shelves stood in uneven rows. The same brass lamp glowed near the counter. Even the clock on the back wall seemed determined to remain several minutes behind the rest of the world. 10 years had passed since he had last opened that door, yet the sight of it pulled him backward with startling force. He could still remember the afternoons spent there after university classes. The conversations about novels that lasted until sunset, and the feeling that life was unfolding exactly as it should. Most of all, he remembered Evelyn. Her laughter had once filled every quiet corner of the store. Her opinions had challenged him. Her presence had made ordinary days feel significant. Then life had intervened in the way it often does. Opportunities appeared. Distances grew. Words that should have been spoken remained trapped behind hesitation. Eventually they stopped speaking altogether. Oliver had convinced himself that moving on was the same thing as forgetting. Standing outside the bookstore, he finally understood how wrong he had been. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The familiar scent of paper and wood greeted him immediately. A small bell chimed overhead. For a moment he wondered if anyone would recognize him. The years had left their mark. His face carried traces of long nights and difficult decisions. His confidence had become quieter. His ambitions had become less certain. Yet some part of him still felt like the young man who had once believed every unanswered question would eventually receive an answer. The woman behind the counter looked up from a stack of books and smiled politely. Oliver returned the smile and wandered between the shelves. He told himself he was only visiting an old place. He told himself he was merely curious. Neither explanation felt convincing. Near the back of the store he noticed a small table surrounded by chairs. A handwritten sign announced a weekly reading group. The sight stirred another memory. Years ago he and Evelyn had organized those gatherings together. They had argued over book selections. They had stayed late arranging chairs. They had laughed when only 3 people attended on stormy evenings. Those moments had seemed ordinary then. Now they felt precious. Oliver reached for a novel on a nearby shelf. As he opened the cover, a folded piece of paper slipped out and landed on the floor. He bent down and picked it up. The note contained only a single sentence written in elegant handwriting. Some stories wait years for their ending. His pulse quickened. The handwriting looked familiar. Impossible, he thought. Yet he knew every curve of those letters. He had seen them countless times before. He turned the paper over. Nothing else was written there. No name. No date. No explanation. He glanced around the bookstore, suddenly aware of how many memories occupied the room with him. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, the clock continued its slow journey through the evening. Oliver folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Perhaps it was coincidence. Perhaps it meant nothing. Still, for the first time in years, he felt the strange pull of unfinished possibilities. As he approached the counter to leave, The woman smiled again and said there would be a reading group the following Thursday. Oliver hesitated before answering. He had planned to return home the next day. He had meetings waiting for him and responsibilities he could not easily ignore. Yet the note in his pocket seemed heavier than paper should have been. He thanked her and promised nothing. When he stepped back into the rain, he looked once more through the window. The bookstore glowed warmly against the dark street, like a memory refusing to fade. Somewhere between the station and his hotel, Oliver realized he was already considering a reason to stay. He did not know that a single forgotten confession would soon begin changing the course of his life. The following morning arrived wrapped in pale sunlight and lingering clouds. Oliver woke earlier than usual, though he had barely slept. The note remained on the bedside table where he had placed it before going to bed. Several times during the night he had picked it up and examined the handwriting, searching for certainty. Each time he reached the same conclusion. It looked exactly like Evelyn's writing. Yet that made no sense. 10 years had passed without a single conversation between them. He knew nothing about her life now. She could have moved across the world. She could have married. She could have forgotten him completely. Still, the sentence on the paper continued to echo in his thoughts. Some stories wait years for their ending. After breakfast he found himself walking through the city without any particular destination. The streets felt smaller than he remembered. Familiar buildings stood beside new cafes and renovated apartments. Time had changed the city without erasing its identity. Oliver wondered if people changed the same way. He stopped beside a small riverside path where he and Evelyn had once spent entire afternoons talking about impossible dreams. Back then they had believed adulthood would arrive with clarity. Instead it had brought compromises, unanswered questions, and unexpected loneliness. His phone vibrated with messages from colleagues asking about his return schedule. He ignored them for the moment and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The bookstore reading group was still 3 days away. He should leave. Every practical instinct told him to leave. Yet he remained. By late afternoon he found himself standing outside the bookstore once again. This time the bell above the door sounded almost welcoming. The woman behind the counter recognized him immediately. She introduced herself as Clara and asked whether he had found what he was looking for the previous evening. Oliver nearly laughed at the question. He was no longer certain what he had been looking for. Before he could answer, Clara disappeared into a back room and returned carrying a cardboard box filled with old photographs. She explained that the store was preparing for an anniversary celebration and was collecting pictures from previous years. Curious, Oliver helped sort through them. Images of literary events, book signings, and reading groups passed through his hands. Faces appeared and disappeared. Years unfolded one photograph at a time. Then he found her. Evelyn stood near the center of an old photograph, smiling directly at the camera. The image stole his breath. She looked younger, of course, but unmistakably herself. Her eyes carried the same intelligence he remembered. Her smile possessed the same quiet warmth. Oliver stared at the photograph longer than he intended. Clara noticed. "You knew Evelyn?" she asked. The casual question landed with surprising force. Oliver nodded. Clara smiled. She still visits occasionally. For a moment the entire bookstore seemed to fall silent around him. She does? He asked. Clara nodded again. Not as often as before. Life gets busy. But she helps with special events sometimes. Oliver looked back at the photograph. A strange mixture of excitement and anxiety settled over him. Until that moment Evelyn had existed only as a memory. Suddenly she was real again. Present. Nearby. Existing somewhere beyond the boundaries of the past. Clara continued organizing photographs while Oliver struggled to appear calm. He considered asking more questions. Was Evelyn happy? Was she married? Did she ever mention him? Instead he remained silent. Some questions felt too dangerous. As evening approached, Clara invited him to attend a planning meeting for the anniversary event. Oliver almost declined. Then he remembered the note. He remembered the photograph. He remembered how many years had passed without answers. He agreed. The meeting was scheduled for the next evening. When he left the bookstore, the city felt different. Possibility had entered places where certainty once lived. He walked slowly toward his hotel, replaying Clara's words again and again. She still visits occasionally. Such a simple sentence. Yet it carried enough weight to reshape his entire week. That night he stood by the hotel window watching lights shimmer across the river. Somewhere in the city, Evelyn was living a life he knew nothing about. Somewhere she might be reading, laughing, working, dreaming. Somewhere she might still remember him. For the first time in a decade, the distance between memory and reality no longer seemed impossible to cross. The next evening arrived more slowly than Oliver expected. He spent most of the day pretending to focus on work emails while his attention wandered elsewhere. Every hour seemed longer than the one before it. By the time he reached the bookstore for the planning meeting, he felt an unfamiliar nervousness tightening his thoughts. It reminded him of younger years, when uncertainty still had the power to accelerate his heartbeat. The bookstore was busier than usual. Several volunteers moved chairs across the floor while others sorted decorations and event schedules. Clara greeted him warmly and immediately handed him a stack of papers to organize. Oliver accepted the task with gratitude. Having something practical to do helped distract him from the question occupying his mind. Would Evelyn be there? He told himself not to expect anything. Cities were large. Lives were complicated. Clara had only said Evelyn helped occasionally. Yet each time the front door opened, his eyes drifted toward it. An hour passed. Then another. The meeting progressed. Discussions about guest speakers and reading schedules filled the room. Oliver gradually relaxed. Perhaps she would not come. Perhaps this entire week was merely an exercise in confronting old memories. He had almost accepted that possibility when the bell above the door chimed. The sound was ordinary. The effect was not. Conversations continued around him, but for a brief moment everything seemed distant. A woman stepped inside carrying a canvas bag filled with books. Rain shimmered on her dark coat. She paused near the entrance and smiled at several familiar faces. Oliver recognized her instantly. Time had changed details but not essence. Her hair was slightly shorter than he remembered. There were subtle traces of maturity in her expression. Yet the intelligence in her eyes remained exactly the same. So did the quiet confidence she carried into every room. Evelyn. The name echoed through his thoughts before he could stop it. She had not noticed him yet. She greeted Clara first. Then another volunteer. Oliver remained frozen beside a shelf, uncertain whether to approach or disappear. 10 years of silence suddenly felt impossible to summarize. Every version of the conversation seemed inadequate. Before he could decide, Evelyn turned in his direction. Their eyes met. The room vanished. At least that was how it felt. Surprise appeared across her face. Not shock. Not discomfort. Simply genuine surprise. For several seconds neither of them moved. Then she smiled. It was not the smile of a stranger recognizing an old acquaintance. It was warmer than that. More personal. More complicated. Oliver, she said softly. Hearing his name in her voice again felt strangely unreal. Hello, Evelyn, he replied. Countless rehearsed sentences disappeared from his mind. The years between them suddenly seemed both enormous and insignificant. She crossed the room toward him. I can't believe you're here, she said. Neither can I, he admitted. She laughed quietly. The sound unlocked memories he had forgotten existed. Afternoons in cafes. Walks beside the river. Long conversations about books and ambitions. For a moment it felt as though time had folded inward. They spoke cautiously at first. Simple questions. How have you been? What are you doing these days? When did you arrive? Each answer revealed fragments of lives lived separately. Oliver learned that Evelyn worked as an editor for a publishing company. She learned that he had built a successful consulting career. Both descriptions sounded strangely incomplete. Professional achievement seemed less important than the years that surrounded them. As the meeting continued, they occasionally returned to practical discussions, but an invisible thread connected their attention. Every glance carried unspoken questions. Every pause contained things neither knew how to express. Later, while stacking chairs together after the meeting ended, Evelyn looked at him thoughtfully. It's strange, she said. I used to imagine running into you again. Then enough time passed that I stopped expecting it. Oliver smiled faintly. I thought about it too. The admission lingered between them. Neither seemed eager to break the silence that followed. Finally Evelyn reached into her bag and removed a notebook. A folded paper slipped out and landed near Oliver's feet. He bent to pick it up. The handwriting on the visible corner was instantly familiar. The same elegant letters. The same careful strokes. Evelyn noticed his expression. What is it? She asked. Oliver hesitated before removing the note from his pocket. The one he had found inside the book. He unfolded it and showed her. The moment her eyes touched the sentence, her expression changed. Recognition flashed across her face. Then came something else. Something deeper. Something unfinished. Where did you find this? She asked quietly. Oliver told her. Evelyn stared at the paper for several seconds. When she finally looked up, there was a seriousness in her eyes he had not seen before. "I wrote that," she said. "A long time ago." The noise of the bookstore faded around them once again. Oliver felt his pulse quicken. After 10 years, the mystery had finally found its owner. What remained hidden was the reason it had been written in the first place. Oliver stared at the note in his hand while Evelyn watched him with an expression he could not fully interpret. The bookstore had nearly emptied. Clara and the remaining volunteers were busy in another room, leaving them alone among the shelves and scattered chairs. Outside, rain drifted softly across the windows, turning the city lights into blurred streaks of gold and silver. "You wrote it?" Oliver asked. Evelyn nodded. "Years ago." She reached for the note and ran her thumb gently across the folded edge. "I had forgotten it even existed." Oliver wanted to ask a dozen questions at once, but only one emerged. "Why did you write it?" Evelyn smiled faintly, though sadness lingered beneath it. "Because I wasn't brave enough to write what I really wanted to say." The answer settled heavily between them. Oliver felt as though they had stepped onto the edge of a conversation delayed by an entire decade. Evelyn looked around the bookstore before speaking again. "Do you remember the last week before you left the city?" she asked. Of course he remembered. Some memories never lost their sharpness. He remembered preparing for a new opportunity in another country. He remembered endless paperwork and rushed goodbyes. Most of all, he remembered standing beside the river with Evelyn on the evening before his departure. They had talked for hours about future plans, but neither had spoken about the growing feelings that existed between them. Fear had disguised itself as practicality. Assumptions had replaced honesty. By the time he left, everything important remained unsaid. "I remember," Oliver replied. Evelyn nodded slowly. "After you left, I kept thinking about that conversation. I kept replaying it and imagining different endings." She laughed softly, though there was little humor in it. "Eventually I wrote several letters. None of them were ever sent." Oliver felt a quiet ache in his chest. "Letters?" She looked at him. "More than I care to admit." For a moment neither spoke. The realization was both comforting and painful. He had spent years believing he alone carried unanswered questions. Now he understood that silence had existed on both sides. Evelyn folded the note carefully and handed it back. "That sentence came from one of those letters," she explained. "I copied it onto a piece of paper and tucked it into a book. I suppose I liked the idea that someone might find it someday." Oliver smiled. "I found it." "Apparently you did." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment the years separating them seemed unusually fragile. The conversation might have continued there, moving directly toward the truths both had avoided for so long. Instead Clara appeared from the back room carrying a stack of event flyers and interrupted the moment. The spell broke gently rather than abruptly. Soon afterward the bookstore began closing for the night. Oliver and Evelyn stepped outside together. The rain had stopped. Cool air filled the streets. For several seconds they stood beneath the bookstore sign, uncertain whether to say goodbye or continue walking. Then Evelyn pointed toward the river. "Do you have somewhere you need to be?" she asked. Oliver smiled. Not tonight. They started walking. The city seemed quieter than usual. Reflections danced across wet pavement. Passing conversations drifted from distant cafes. At first they spoke about ordinary things. Favorite books. Mutual friends they had lost touch with. Changes in the city. Yet beneath every subject lingered the awareness that they were approaching something larger. Eventually they reached the riverside path they had known years before. The benches had been replaced. Several new buildings stood nearby. Still, the river moved with the same patient rhythm. They stopped near the railing. Evelyn rested her hands lightly against the metal and stared at the water. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." She hesitated. "When you left all those years ago, why didn't you say anything?" Oliver already knew what she meant. He looked toward the river before answering. "Because I thought staying silent would make leaving easier." Evelyn nodded as though she had expected the answer. "Did it?" He laughed quietly. "Not even a little." The honesty surprised them both. Evelyn looked down and smiled to herself. "Good," she said. "That sounds terrible, but good." Oliver understood exactly what she meant. There was comfort in discovering that regret had not belonged to only one person. The silence that followed felt different from the silence of years ago. This one was not empty. It was filled with understanding. Before they parted that evening, Evelyn reached into her bag and removed a small notebook. She held it for a moment before offering it to him. "Take this," she said. Oliver looked confused. "What is it?" Evelyn's smile returned, softer this time. "One of the things I never sent." He accepted the notebook carefully. Its cover was worn from age. Inside waited words written during a chapter of life neither had fully escaped. As Oliver looked at the notebook in his hands, he realized that the story he thought had ended 10 years earlier might finally be beginning again. Oliver did not open the notebook until he returned to his hotel room. For nearly an hour it remained on the desk while he paced between the window and the bed, uncertain whether he was ready to read words that had survived an entire decade in silence. Outside, the city glowed beneath scattered clouds. Inside, the notebook seemed to possess a gravity of its own. Eventually curiosity overcame hesitation. He sat down, opened the cover, and turned to the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably Evelyn's. Neat. Thoughtful. Familiar. The first entry was dated 3 weeks after his departure. Oliver felt his chest tighten as he began to read. The words were not dramatic. They were not declarations meant to impress anyone. They were honest observations about absence. Evelyn wrote about passing the bookstore and instinctively looking toward the corner where he usually Saturday. She wrote about reaching for her phone before remembering there was no message waiting. She wrote about conversations that continued in her imagination long after they should have ended. Each page revealed emotions she had never spoken aloud. Oliver read slowly, absorbing every sentence. Occasionally he paused, not because the words were difficult to understand, but because they were difficult to feel. There was something uniquely powerful about discovering evidence of a shared history that neither person had fully acknowledged at the time. As the pages progressed, the entries became more personal. Evelyn described moments of hope when she considered contacting him. She described moments of doubt when she convinced herself it was too late. Again and again she circled the same question. What if? What if she had spoken more honestly? What if he had stayed? What if one conversation had unfolded differently? Oliver recognized the pattern immediately because he had lived his own version of it. For years he had buried similar thoughts beneath work and routine. Yet there they were, reflected back at him in another person's handwriting. Near midnight he reached an entry that forced him to stop reading altogether. The date corresponded to his birthday 10 years earlier. The entry was short. Only a few lines. But every word carried weight. Evelyn had written that she loved him. Not in the uncertain language of possibility. Not as a hypothetical future. Simply as truth. She had written it plainly and directly. Then she had never sent it. Oliver closed the notebook and stared at the wall. The room suddenly felt smaller. His mind traveled backward through years of missed opportunities and mistaken assumptions. He remembered believing she viewed him only as a friend. He remembered convincing himself that risking honesty would only complicate their lives. Now he understood how completely wrong he had been. Sleep became impossible. By morning he had barely rested. Yet exhaustion was accompanied by something unexpected. Clarity. For the first time in years, he no longer wondered whether the connection between them had been real. The notebook had answered that question. What remained uncertain was what those feelings meant now. Later that afternoon he received a message from Evelyn asking if he would like to meet for coffee. The simplicity of the invitation made him smile. He agreed immediately. They chose a small cafe overlooking a quiet square. When Oliver arrived, Evelyn was already there, reading a manuscript marked with handwritten notes. She looked up and smiled as he approached. The gesture felt natural, as though years had not separated them at all. After ordering drinks, they settled into a corner table beside the window. For a while they discussed ordinary subjects. Books. Publishing. Travel. Yet both seemed aware of the notebook waiting silently between them. Finally Evelyn set down her cup. "You read it," she said. It was not a question. Oliver nodded. "Yes." A brief silence followed. "And?" she asked gently. Oliver searched for the right words. "I wish I had read it 10 years ago." Evelyn looked down at the table. Her expression softened. "So do I." The honesty between them no longer felt frightening. It felt necessary. Neither wanted to return to the safety of avoidance. Too much time had already been lost. Oliver reached into his bag and placed the notebook carefully on the table. "There's something you should know," he said. Evelyn looked at him curiously. "What?" He took a slow breath. "You weren't the only one writing things you never sent." Surprise appeared in her eyes. Then understanding. Then a smile. Small at first. Genuine. Hopeful. Outside the cafe, people crossed the square without noticing the quiet transformation occurring at a table near the window. Inside, two lives that had drifted apart years earlier were beginning to reveal the truths they had hidden from themselves and from each other. And for the first time, neither seemed interested in running from the conversation that awaited them. Evelyn leaned back slightly in her chair, her eyes fixed on Oliver as though she were trying to determine whether she had heard him correctly. Around them, the cafe continued its ordinary rhythm. Cups clinked against saucers. Quiet conversations drifted through the room. Outside, sunlight spilled across the square. Yet for both of them, the world had narrowed to a single table and a single confession. "You wrote things too?" Evelyn asked softly. Oliver nodded. "Not as many as you." A faint smile appeared on her face. "You don't know how many there were." "Fair point." She laughed, and the tension eased for a moment. Then Oliver reached into his bag and removed a small envelope. Time had faded its color slightly, but he had carried it with him through 3 different cities and more years than he cared to admit. Evelyn looked at it with growing curiosity. "What's that?" she asked. Oliver placed it carefully on the table between them. "Something I never mailed." The expression in her eyes changed. Not surprise exactly. Something deeper. Recognition. She understood immediately what it meant to keep words for years without sharing them. Slowly, she picked up the envelope and examined it. Her name was written on the front in his handwriting. The sight alone seemed enough to leave her momentarily speechless. "You kept it all this time?" she asked. "Apparently I did." She looked up at him. "Why?" Oliver considered the question. "At first I told myself there would be a better time to send it. Then too much time passed. After that, it became harder every year." Evelyn traced her finger lightly across the envelope. "I understand that." He knew she did. Few people could understand it better. For several seconds neither moved. Then Oliver nodded toward the letter. "You can read it if you want." Evelyn hesitated. "Now." "Whenever you're ready." She took a slow breath and carefully opened the envelope. The paper inside was folded several times. Oliver suddenly became aware of how exposed he felt. Years ago he had written those words alone in a small apartment hundreds of miles away. At the time he never imagined anyone would actually read them. Now the person for whom they were intended sat directly across from him. Evelyn unfolded the pages and began reading. Her expression shifted gradually as she moved through the letter. Curiosity became concentration. Concentration became emotion. At one point she smiled. At another she blinked several times and looked away from the page. Oliver remained silent. The letter belonged to her now. When she finally finished, she folded the pages carefully and placed them back inside the envelope. Neither spoke immediately. Words seemed unnecessary. The letter had already said enough. "You loved me," Evelyn said at last. It was not a dramatic statement. It was quiet. Simple. True. Oliver met her gaze. Yes. The honesty felt surprisingly peaceful. There was no longer any reason to hide behind uncertainty. Evelyn looked out the window for a moment before speaking again. "Do you know what's strange?" she asked. "What?" For years I imagined what it would feel like to hear that. She smiled sadly. I always pictured being angry. Oliver laughed softly. And are you? No. She shook her head. Mostly I feel relieved. Relief. The words settled comfortably between them. That was exactly what he felt too. Not regret. Not bitterness. Relief that the truth had finally reached daylight. They remained in the cafe for hours afterward. The conversation drifted naturally from old memories to present realities. They spoke about relationships that had come and gone. About careers that had succeeded and disappointed them. About dreams they had achieved and others they had quietly abandoned. The more they talked, the more Oliver realized something important. He was not reconnecting with a memory. He was getting to know the person Evelyn had become. She was no longer the woman he remembered from 10 years ago. She was wiser. More confident. More willing to speak honestly. And somehow he found himself admiring her even more. As evening approached, they left the cafe and wandered through the city without destination. The conversation never seemed to run out. Every street revealed another story. Every story revealed another layer of understanding. Eventually they reached a small park overlooking the river. The same river that had witnessed their final conversation years earlier. They sat on a bench and watched the water move beneath the fading light. Do you ever think about how different everything could have been? Evelyn asked. Oliver considered the question carefully. Sometimes. She nodded. Me too. A gentle silence followed. Then she added, but if everything had happened differently, we wouldn't be the people sitting here now. Oliver looked at her. There was wisdom in the observation. They had spent years imagining alternate histories, yet neither could ignore the value of the journeys that had shaped them. The past could not be rewritten. The future, however, remained unwritten. As the first lights appeared across the river, Evelyn turned toward him. There was no hesitation in her expression now. No uncertainty. Only sincerity. I'm glad you came back, she said. Oliver smiled. I'm glad I stayed. Neither realized it yet, but the most important question was no longer whether they had loved each other in the past. The question waiting ahead was far more significant. After finally uncovering 10 years of unfinished confessions, would they find the courage to begin an entirely new chapter together? The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither Oliver nor Evelyn had planned. What began as a chance reunion gradually transformed into something neither wanted to interrupt. Each morning seemed to bring a new message. A recommendation for a book. A photograph of a street they both remembered. A question that led to an hour-long conversation. Neither acknowledged how quickly these small exchanges had become part of their daily lives. They simply allowed it to happen. For Oliver, the experience felt strangely unfamiliar despite its comfort. He had spent years building a life defined by schedules, responsibilities, and measurable goals. Most of his decisions were practical, predictable, efficient. Yet nothing about his renewed connection with Evelyn fit neatly into those categories. The more time they spent together, the less interested he became in treating life as a series of problems waiting to be solved. One afternoon they met at the bookstore to help prepare for the anniversary event. Volunteers moved between shelves arranging displays and decorations while Clara supervised with cheerful determination. Oliver found himself standing on a ladder hanging framed photographs along one wall. Evelyn stood below organizing captions. Every few minutes they exchanged comments that somehow evolved into laughter. Clara eventually walked past them and shook her head with amusement. "You two sound exactly the same as you did years ago," she said. Evelyn glanced upward. "Is that a compliment?" "Absolutely." Clara smiled. "The bookstore has been much quieter without you." After Clara moved away, a brief silence followed. Oliver climbed down from the ladder and looked at an old photograph resting on a nearby table. It showed a reading group from nearly 12 years earlier. He and Evelyn stood near the center, smiling at something beyond the camera. Neither was touching the other, yet the connection between them seemed obvious now. "Everyone else noticed before we did," Oliver said. Evelyn looked at the photograph and laughed softly. "Apparently." Then her smile faded into thoughtfulness. "Maybe we noticed. Maybe we were just afraid." Oliver could not argue with that. Fear had shaped more of their story than either cared to admit. Fear of rejection. Fear of change. Fear of risking a friendship that already meant so much. Those fears had once seemed sensible. Looking back, they felt expensive. That evening, after the volunteers left, Oliver and Evelyn remained behind to finish a few final tasks. The bookstore felt peaceful in the quiet hours after closing. Lamps cast warm pools of light across the shelves. Shadows stretched between rows of books. Somewhere in the back, an old clock continued its patient ticking. Oliver found himself standing in the exact aisle where he had discovered the mysterious note only days earlier. The memory made him smile. "What are you thinking about?" Evelyn asked. He held up the folded paper he still carried in his wallet. "This." Her eyes widened slightly. "You kept it. It started all of this." Evelyn looked at the note for several seconds. "I never imagined anyone would find it. I'm glad I did." The simplicity of the statement lingered between them. Evelyn stepped closer. Not dramatically. Just enough to narrow the space that had existed between them for years. "So am I," she said. For a moment neither looked away. The atmosphere shifted subtly. The bookstore around them remained unchanged, yet something important felt different. The comfort they shared had deepened into something neither could ignore any longer. Still, neither rushed to define it. They had learned enough from the past to respect moments that deserved patience. Later, as they walked through the evening streets, Oliver noticed how naturally their steps matched. They paused at shop windows. Shared observations. Fell into comfortable silences that required no explanation. It felt less like rediscovering someone and more like returning to a conversation interrupted years ago. Yet beneath that comfort lingered a growing awareness of time. Oliver's return to the city had never been intended as a permanent stay. His apartment, work commitments, and entire routine existed elsewhere. The reality remained quietly in the background. Unspoken but present. Eventually they reached the small bridge crossing the river near the city center. The water below reflected countless lights. Evelyn rested her hands on the railing and gazed at the current. "When are you supposed to leave?" she asked. The question arrived gently, but Oliver felt its weight immediately. He stared at the river before answering. 3 days. Evelyn nodded slowly. She did not look surprised. Perhaps she had always known the question was coming. 3 days, she repeated. Neither spoke for a while. The city moved around them. Cars crossed distant streets. Laughter drifted from nearby cafes. Life continued as normal. Yet the future suddenly felt less certain than it had an hour earlier. Oliver realized that during the past week he had become so focused on rediscovering Evelyn that he had avoided considering what came next. Eventually he turned toward her. "I don't know what happens after that," he admitted. Evelyn smiled, though there was sadness in her eyes. "Neither do I." Her honesty made the moment more difficult and more meaningful. They had finally found the courage to face the truths of their past. Now they stood before a different challenge altogether. The distance that had separated them once before was waiting patiently at the edge of the future. And neither of them could pretend it did not exist. The question of Oliver's departure lingered over the next 2 days like a distant storm cloud. Neither he nor Evelyn avoided the subject, yet neither seemed eager to confront it directly. Instead they continued spending time together, perhaps understanding that some moments become more valuable when their future feels uncertain. The bookstore anniversary event arrived on a bright Saturday afternoon. Guests filled every corner of the building. Conversations drifted between shelves. Local authors signed books. Readers exchanged recommendations and stories. Clara moved through the crowd with the satisfaction of someone watching a long-planned celebration finally come to life. Oliver and Evelyn spent most of the day helping wherever they were needed. Yet despite the activity surrounding them, both remained aware of the approaching end of Oliver's visit. Late in the afternoon, Clara gathered several volunteers for a commemorative photograph. Everyone arranged themselves between the bookshelves while a local journalist prepared the camera. Oliver found himself standing beside Evelyn. Their shoulders brushed lightly. Neither moved away. The photographer asked everyone to smile. As the camera flashed, Oliver experienced an unexpected feeling. Not nostalgia. Not regret. Gratitude. Years earlier he had stood in almost the same place beside the same woman without understanding what she truly meant to him. This time was different. Whatever happened next, uncertainty would not be mistaken for indifference. The event continued into the evening. Eventually the crowd thinned and volunteers began cleaning up. As they worked, Clara approached Oliver with a curious expression. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." She glanced briefly toward Evelyn, who was organizing books nearby. "Are you leaving again?" Oliver hesitated. "I'm supposed to." Clara nodded as though confirming something she already suspected. Life has a habit of giving people second chances only occasionally. Before Oliver could respond, she smiled and walked away. The comment stayed with him long after the conversation ended. That night he returned to his hotel and stared at the suitcase resting near the wall. Until recently, leaving had seemed obvious. His return ticket was booked. Meetings were scheduled. Responsibilities waited. Yet for the first time in years, practical decisions no longer felt sufficient on their own. He found himself wondering whether success meant anything if it consistently pulled him away from the people who mattered most. The following morning he met Evelyn for breakfast at a quiet cafe near the river. The atmosphere between them was warm but thoughtful. Both understood that the conversation they had postponed could no longer wait. After their coffee arrived, Evelyn folded her hands around the cup and looked at him directly. "You've been thinking," she said. Oliver smiled. "That obvious?" "Very." He laughed softly. "Then yes. I have." Evelyn nodded. "So have I." For several seconds they simply looked at one another. There was no tension in the silence. Only honesty. Eventually Oliver spoke first. 10 years ago I left because I believed opportunities only appeared once." Evelyn listened carefully. "And now?" He considered his answer. "Now I'm not sure opportunities are always professional." A faint smile appeared on her face. "That sounds like something you wouldn't have said 10 years ago." "Probably not." She looked out the window briefly before returning her attention to him. "People change." "They do." Another pause followed. Then Evelyn asked the question both had been approaching for days. "What do you want, Oliver?" The simplicity of the words made them impossible to avoid. Oliver stared at his coffee. He thought about the life waiting elsewhere. The apartment. The work. The routine. Then he thought about the previous week. About rediscovered conversations. Shared laughter. Old truths finally spoken aloud. About finding a sense of belonging he had not realized he missed. When he finally answered, his voice was calm. "I want to stop making decisions based on fear." Evelyn's expression softened. She understood immediately. Perhaps because she had reached a similar conclusion herself. "That's a good place to start," she said quietly. They spent the rest of the morning walking beside the river. The city moved around them in familiar patterns. Street musicians played beneath bridges. Cyclists passed along the waterfront. Sunlight sparkled across the water. At one point they stopped near the exact location where they had said goodbye years earlier. Neither mentioned the memory at first. They simply stood there, aware of it. Eventually Evelyn smiled. "You know, I used to hate this spot." Oliver looked surprised. "Really?" She nodded. "For a long time it reminded me of losing something important." He glanced at the river. "And now?" Evelyn turned toward him. Her eyes were bright with quiet certainty. "Now it reminds me that some things can find their way back." The words settled between them with remarkable clarity. For years both had believed their story belonged entirely to the past. Yet here they were, standing together once again at the place where everything had once ended. The difference was that this time neither wanted to walk away without knowing what came next. And as Oliver looked at Evelyn beneath the morning sunlight, he realized the most important decision of his life might arrive long before his scheduled departure. Oliver spent that evening alone, wandering through the city after parting ways with Evelyn. The streets that had once felt familiar now seemed filled with new meaning. Every corner held a memory. Every memory carried a question. For years he had believed adulthood required certainty before action. Yet some of the most important moments of his life had arrived wrapped in uncertainty. Meeting Evelyn years ago. Leaving the city. Returning unexpectedly. Finding the note hidden inside a forgotten book. None of those events had been planned. All of them had changed him. As darkness settled across the skyline, he found himself standing outside the bookstore once again. The windows were dark. The doors locked. Yet the building seemed alive with the stories it contained. He looked through the glass and smiled. A single sentence written on a scrap of paper had brought him here. A sentence born from courage that arrived too late. Or perhaps not too late after all. His phone vibrated. A message from Evelyn appeared on the screen. "Are you awake?" Oliver laughed quietly and replied immediately. "Very much so." A few moments later another message arrived. "Come to the river." 20 minutes later he found her waiting near the old bridge. The city lights shimmered across the water behind her. She wore a dark coat against the cool evening air, her hands tucked into the pockets. When she saw him approaching, she smiled. There was something different about her expression. Not nervousness. Not hesitation. Determination. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Neither could I." They began walking slowly along the riverbank. Neither seemed interested in discussing the weather or books or any of the smaller topics that had once helped them avoid deeper truths. The time for those conversations had passed. Eventually they stopped beneath a row of trees overlooking the water. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Evelyn turned toward him. "I've been thinking about something," she said. Oliver waited. "For 10 years I imagined what I would say if I ever saw you again." A faint smile touched her lips. "The problem is that none of those imagined conversations happened. Life rarely follows the script." "Exactly." She looked down briefly before continuing. "And because of that, I realized something." Oliver felt his heartbeat quicken. "What?" Evelyn met his gaze. "I don't want to spend another decade imagining conversations instead of having them." The honesty in her voice carried extraordinary weight. Oliver understood immediately. Every missed opportunity between them had begun with silence. Every regret had grown in the absence of truth. This moment demanded something different. "Neither do I," he said. Evelyn took a slow breath. "Good." Then she laughed softly at herself. "I had a much more elegant speech prepared in my head." Oliver smiled. "I'm glad you abandoned it." "Me too." The distance between them felt smaller than ever. Not because they had moved closer physically, but because there was finally nothing hidden behind caution. No letters left unsent. No feelings disguised as friendship. No assumptions filling the spaces where honesty belonged. Just two people standing together beneath the night sky, speaking openly at last. "Can I ask you something?" Evelyn said. "Anything." "If you stay, what happens?" Oliver considered the question carefully. "I don't know." She laughed. "That's not very reassuring." "It's honest." He smiled. "I know what I want." I just don't know exactly how we get there. Evelyn looked at him thoughtfully. And what do you want? This time the answer arrived without hesitation. You. The word hung in the air between them. Simple. Direct. True. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly as though absorbing the reality of finally hearing it spoken aloud. When she opened them again, emotion shimmered there. Do you know how long I waited to hear that? She asked quietly. Oliver stepped closer. Probably longer than you should have. She laughed through the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. Definitely longer. For a moment neither spoke. Then Evelyn reached for his hand. The gesture was small. Natural. Yet it carried the weight of every unfinished year behind them. Oliver intertwined his fingers with hers. The contact felt both entirely new and strangely familiar. I'm tired of goodbyes, Evelyn said. So am I. They stood together beside the river while the city lights reflected across the water. Neither pretended the future would be simple. There would be decisions to make. Careers to reconsider. Practical realities to navigate. Yet for the first time, those challenges felt secondary. The hardest part had never been distance. It had been fear. And fear no longer seemed in control of their story. As they continued walking through the night, hand in hand, Oliver realized something remarkable. The confessions that had once remained unfinished were finally complete. What remained unwritten now was not the ending of their story. It was the beginning of a new one. 3 months later, autumn arrived quietly. The city streets filled with golden leaves, cooler evenings, and the familiar scent of rain that always seemed to return at exactly the right moment. Much had changed since the night Oliver and Evelyn stood beside the river and finally spoke the truths they had hidden for years. Yet the most surprising part was how natural those changes felt. Life had not transformed overnight. There had been conversations, plans, compromises, and uncertainties. Real life rarely offered dramatic solutions. Instead, it offered choices. One decision at a time. Oliver had postponed his departure several times before eventually making a larger decision. Rather than returning permanently to the life he had built elsewhere, he reorganized his work so he could remain in the city. The process was neither simple nor immediate. Some colleagues questioned the choice. Others encouraged it. For once, however, he measured success differently. The answer he followed was not the most efficient one. It was simply the one that felt true. Evelyn, meanwhile, continued her work as an editor, though she often joked that her biggest project had become helping Oliver rediscover how to live without planning every moment 6 months in advance. He insisted the accusation was unfair. She insisted it was entirely accurate. The debate remained unresolved. Together they built something neither had expected. Not a perfect relationship. Not a story without challenges. Something better. A relationship grounded in honesty. The years they had spent apart taught them lessons they might never have learned otherwise. They became more willing to speak openly. More willing to admit fears before those fears became walls. More willing to choose vulnerability over silence. One rainy afternoon they sat together in the bookstore after closing. The anniversary celebration had long passed, yet the place remained central to both their lives. Clara often claimed they spent so much time there that she should start charging rent. On this particular evening, the bookstore was quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Lamps cast warm circles of light across shelves filled with stories. Evelyn sat at a table reviewing manuscript pages while Oliver sorted donations nearby. It was an ordinary moment. And that was precisely what made it meaningful. Years ago they had imagined grand declarations and perfect resolutions. Reality offered something different. Shared routines. Comfortable silences. Familiar laughter. The simple privilege of being present in each other's lives. Oliver discovered that happiness often looked far less dramatic than he once expected. At one point Evelyn closed her notebook and looked toward him. "Do you ever think about the note?" she asked. Oliver smiled immediately. "The one hidden inside the book?" "That one." He considered the question. "Every now and then." Evelyn laughed. A single sentence caused an unbelievable amount of trouble. And opportunity. Fair point. She stood and walked toward the shelf where he had first found it. For a moment she examined the books thoughtfully. "Imagine if you had chosen a different novel. Imagine if I hadn't entered the bookstore at all." Their eyes met. The possibility felt impossible now. Entire futures sometimes depended upon the smallest decisions. A step through a doorway. A note inside a book. A conversation finally begun. Evelyn reached into her bag and removed a folded piece of paper. "I found something recently," she said. Oliver accepted it. The handwriting was hers. Older than the pages he had already read. He unfolded it carefully. At the top appeared a date from nearly 11 years earlier. Beneath it was a single unfinished sentence. "If I ever get another chance, I hope I have the courage to tell him." The sentence ended there. Nothing followed. Oliver looked up. "You never finished it." Evelyn smiled. "No. I suppose I didn't." He folded the page gently. "Do you know what I think?" "What?" "I think you eventually did." Emotion softened her expression. For several seconds neither spoke. The rain continued outside. The bookstore remained quiet around them. Yet neither silence felt incomplete anymore. Years earlier they had allowed fear to interrupt their story. They had mistaken uncertainty for impossibility. They had left entire chapters unwritten. But life, with all its strange timing and unexpected generosity, had given them another opportunity. Not to erase the past. Not to rewrite every mistake. Simply to continue. Later that evening they locked the bookstore together and stepped into the cool autumn air. The rain had stopped. Reflections shimmered across the pavement. The city stretched before them, alive with ordinary moments and unknown futures. Oliver took Evelyn's hand. She squeezed it gently. Then they began walking home. Not toward an ending. Not toward a perfect destination. Simply forward. And for the first time in a very long time, neither of them wondered what might have happened if they had spoken sooner. The unfinished confessions were no longer unfinished. They had become part of a larger story. One still being written. One page at a time.